Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first Innovate Queensland Grid webinar for 2018 with Grid Giving Research and Ideas Direction. My name is Leanne Wyville from Presence Communications, and I'm working with Impact Innovation to deliver the Innovate Queensland program, which supports the Queensland Government's Advance Queensland initiative. Today's webinar presenter is Dr Lewe Atkinson, Australian Global Partner with Haines Centre for Strategic Management, and Lewe will be sharing his techniques for thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur. Just while we're waiting for other people to connect to the webinar, I'm going to go through the tools that we will be using today, just for those people who may not have used this system before. Okay, so what you should be able to see on your screen at the moment is the slide, plus you will have your own control panel, usually on the right-hand side. And there's a couple of controls on there that we may be using today. The first one is the raise your hand button. We tend to use that for when the presenter will ask you a question. And so I might ask you a question, and what I might do for the moment is just to see how many people have actually located that hand button. So click on it and put your hand up if you know what I'm talking about. Oh, great. Quite a few hands going up there. That's terrific. So I'll just drop those all down. Okay, so if you want to ask Lewe a question, please type it into the question box that's just a little bit further down your control panel, and we'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. There's also some handouts for you, and I recommend that you start downloading them now, or you can do that anytime throughout the webinar. But once the webinar is over, then definitely you won't be able to access those handouts, and you'll have to send us an email requesting those. But there's a copy of the presentation that Lewe has agreed to share with you, plus another handout from Haines Centre for Strategic Management, and also there's some information about other events that are coming up through Innovate Queensland. Okay, so I'm about to hand over the reins to Lewe. Now, Lewe has spent the last 20 years helping businesses, community and government organisations and leaders to develop better services and lower their costs by thinking, planning and acting more strategically. He's had more than 30 years experience in knowledge production and transfer in both commercial and public good innovation pathways to market. He has a solid technical and financial grounding, a strong creative side, and that enables him to see the patterns and pathways and solutions that others often miss. And he works with his clients all over Australia, facilitating, consulting with strategic planning and management, innovation, cross-boundary collaboration, and research leadership development. So Lewe, I've got you on cue, and I'm about to hand the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Leanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, everyone. A new 5:30 slot, which we hope makes it easier for people to come on board. I'm just going to share my webcam for a short period of time, just to introduce myself, and then I'll drop off. So don't panic if you can no longer see me as the webinar proceeds. So Leanne asked me to think about doing something to do with systems thinking, because it seems to be an emergent and increasingly important field of work, and so I was able to sort of conjure up something from something that we'd created over the last 18 months for our clients: think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. And so the session that I'll just share with you over the next half hour will be a cocktail version of a program that we run for half a day with our clients. So just moving on, if I can. There's a photograph of me in Canada. I've been accosted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Obviously, that was a TP that I wasn't supposed to look inside. But what I'm highlighting there is that I'm part of a global network of consultants who use the systems thinking approach, and that's our point of difference. And we have people located in all the major continents around the world. And of course, there you can see me in Calgary, Canada. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about some of the work that one of our partners in Canada, Valerie McLeod, does with respect to strategic life planning, the systems thinking approach. As I move on to the next slide, just a little bit more detail on me and my background. I won't go into any of the detail there. You can read it for yourselves and in the handouts. But I started with Unilever in manufacturing, engineering and R&D, PhD in chemical engineering, spin out startup company based on CSIRO technology earlier in my career. I was an early hire in the first Rural Research and Development Corporation, limited by guarantee, Meat and Livestock Australia. And since that period of time, 16 years, I've now joined the Haines Centre for Strategic Management. And why do we think systems thinking is important? And this is the juncture where I'll drop off the camera. Well, how you think is how you make judgments, which is how you act, and it determines the results that you get at home, business and in life. And we'll go into a bit more deeper dive about what system thinking is all about in a moment. So the storyboard for the session is a 30-minute overview. What is a system? How do you fit within a system? What's your sweet spot? What system level are you trying to change? Looking at patterns and joining up the dots, which is what entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs are particularly good at. Leveraging the ecosystem, which is quite a trendy term at the moment, but it's quite relevant to systems thinking. Exposing your mental models to the customer, and that's really has gained a lot of prevalence in more current thinking around design-led thinking, which as I'll share with us shortly, is a systems thinking approach as well. We'll wrap up with 15 minutes questions. The handouts, just to cover those. Valerie McLeod, I mentioned earlier, from Canada. She's written a book, Get Me Off the Treadmill, but also a summary article, Career and Life Planning, also a template. We're going to talk about the 10 tools for thinking like a system, acting like an entrepreneur, and you can take those away with you as well. And of course, a copy of this slide deck. And if you're interested in anything else relative to systems thinking resources, please come to our website, hainescenteraustralia.com.au. You can see the link there. So what's a system? Systems can only be understood and defined in the context of the higher level system and environment within which it exists. So there's no accident that that's a stairway diagram there, because systems are made up of a set of interrelated components that all have to work together to achieve the overall objectives of the whole. That's what we call the output of a system. And when we're talking about the overall objectives of the whole, generally it's a higher order purpose. And in the context of entrepreneurial thinking, that higher order purpose is obviously the customer that we're trying to serve. Really important concept in systems thinking is this notion of nested interdependent systems. And if you think about it in the way that I describe these cones that nest inside each other, you can think about the cones you often see on sporting fields. And we've got, if you like, the whole of Earth ecosystem, and societies sit within that, within which organizations operate, teams and units, families, individuals, organs, all the way down to cells. Now, where we normally operate when we're talking about systems thinking is, of course, individuals make up teams, who make up organizations, who operate within societies and economies. That's the level that we work at. It's important to remember the numbers here, 3, 4, 5, and 6, as we translate to talking about one of the really most important principles of systems thinking is knowing what level you're actually working at when you're trying to affect a change of systems. And we describe it in terms of numbers, as you can see here. 3 is self, 3A is interpersonal skills, one-to-one. 4 is at team level, and then between teams or between departments. Total organisation, of course, number 6 is the interaction of the organisation or the company or the entity with the environment, obviously the market environment there, and that's sourced from well-known reference in systems thinking. We often express this notion of nested systems in terms of the babushka dolls or the Russian dolls. And when we talk about self, we talk about you being the tiniest little doll inside those increasingly larger dolls as they scale up towards the team, the organisation, to the economy or environment within which you are part of. And it's really important to also understand that nothing exists in isolation. These parts are all interrelated, and it's actually the interactions between each of these levels that are really the core to effective systems thinking and identifying opportunities for leverage in terms of achieving change in marketplaces. So again, understanding how these systems are nested or interrelated. You can see the self, the individual intrapreneur or entrepreneur at the heart of these nested systems, and radiating out from that is your relationship with others in terms of teams, departments, organizations, etc. So it's really important to understand the concept of you're at the center of these emergent radiating systems beyond you. So if you want to change what's going on around you, you really need to be clear about you as a person in terms of understanding what is it about you, what is your sweet spot, what is your clarity of purpose. And there's a really nice concept, that's just a nice quote from John D. Rockefeller in terms of the 2 simple principles. Find out what you're interested in or what you're good at as an individual, and then put everything into it and you'll be on the pathway to happiness. There's another concept called the hedgehog principle, which is a really nice principle that was leveraged by Jim Collins in Good to Great. You know, think about the overlap, the sweet spot between what you can do best in the world, what you're really passionate about, and what drives your economic engine. How do you make money out of it? And once you resolve that as an entrepreneur, you can then start to influence the rest of the world or other systems around you. Really nice quote here is, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise and I'm changing myself. So really understanding that at the beginning of systems thinking is understanding yourself. And when you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur, that's really important, because you need to understand where your risk taking level is. And when often we find that if you've got too much of a risk aversion, you're not getting the maximum benefit out of the opportunities that you've got in front of you. If you're over risk oriented, or certainly excessive risk taking, can send you crashing down the other side. So somehow as an individual entrepreneur, intrapreneur, you've got to find that sweet spot. So what's your end game? This is where our favorite Kenny Rogers principle comes in. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. Thanks, Kenny Rogers, for that notion, because when you are trying to scale and develop your concept as a systems thinking entrepreneur, it's really important to know where your limits and boundaries are, where your opportunities are to pivot, etc. And of course, being focused on what the end in mind is really quite critical as well in terms of making that journey. And we use a really nice systems thinking tool when we're working with people. It's called the rollercoaster of change. And when we see people start their journey towards whatever they're trying to achieve, their vision, they have to commit to the change, of course, go through the shock and denial that might come with that. And those of you who have participated in accelerator programs, those really concentrated 3-month journeys, you're probably really familiar with this roller coaster. You've got to hang in there once you've worked your way through all of the options and figured out that it's worthwhile continuing, hope and readjustment and rebuilding. And this is really important from 2 perspectives. This journey is natural, normal, and highly predictable. But it's also something that everyone needs to go through in order to achieve the changes necessary to become a success in a new context. So let's start to introduce the first of these 10 tools that we think are really important to consider in terms of a systems thinking concept. One of the first mistakes people often make is failing to begin with the end in mind. So having really strong clarity around purpose, you as an individual, but of course making sure you've got really strong insight into the purpose of the organisation you're trying to create. Another common mistake we often see when people fail to appropriately think as a system is lack of adaptability or proactivity in terms of a changing environment. So constant environmental scanning is really critical to avoid those blind spots that might be coming your way that you're not prepared for. Of course, Einstein gets an introduction here, and I think it's a really powerful statement he makes. We cannot solve our problems at the same level of thinking we used when we created them. So we need to be really clear what level we're working at in terms of solving customer problems, our own problems, our organizational problems as well. And typically what you'll find is you have to move up a level in systems thinking to enable you to solve a problem at the level that you're working at now. Jumping across system levels is something that's very peculiar and typical of good intrapreneurs. And lateral thinking was the thing that was originally sort of highlighting this notion of pattern switching in an asymmetric pattern system. So that's a guy called Edward de Bono, who you may remember from the 70s. That's his island, in fact, just in the bottom left-hand corner, which is just off the north of Mackay, which apparently he sold in 2008. But he says that entrepreneurs think by jumping across patterns rather than just following along them. So they're always the first with the insight, after which everyone thinks it becomes the obvious. So knowing what system level you're working at is a really critical intrapreneurial skill. Here's a couple of more tools that we would like to introduce, also systems thinking tools. The first one on the left-hand side is thinking backwards, or backwards thinking, which sounds a bit strange, but again, it's related to this notion of what would we really want to achieve that's going to really make us different and highly competitive, and then how do we work backwards from there to make what we're trying to achieve a reality. And that notion of looping thinking and working backwards from a clear and desired outcome is a really important strategic thinking and intrapreneurial thinking tool. The other is feedback is a gift. Remember what we said earlier, expose your mental models as early as possible. The notion of minimum viable product is a really powerful one here, because what we advise entrepreneurs and systems thinkers to do is get those models out there and share them with others and get to your customers and get feedback as soon as possible. So one of the ways we often think about systems thinkers and intrapreneurs, is they're sort of slightly different from the classic causal thinker. The managerial mindset, we often call it on the left-hand side, whereas the systems thinking layer jumper will be what we call an effectuational style thinker, and always looking for the pivot point, always co-creating with customers as they work from left to right. And that's a really nice illustration of how you systems thinkers and entrepreneurial thinkers think. And remember, I mentioned earlier that notion of minimum viable product. Feedback is a gift. Getting things out in front of customers as early as possible, build it, measure it, and learn from it is a systematic looping cycle, which is very typical of a systems thinking approach. One of my favorite sayings, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So it doesn't have to be perfect before you seek feedback on the idea. Next two of the 10 tools is getting a helicopter view. So if you get up high enough in those system levels, you can see multiple outcomes or a superordinate goal. So it doesn't mean it has to be win-lose. Often we find win-win opportunities if we can get up above where we're working at. Remember what Einstein said in an earlier slide, the sort of thinking that cause the problems we have today can't be solved with that same level of thinking. So that helicopter view, tool number 5, is really powerful to remind people of that. And of course, booster shots are really critical as well. So what we do know as a systems thinker, we know entropy exists, which is the second law of thermodynamics, whereby things will always tend to a state of disorder. So you always have to be working on things to ensure that strategic initiatives and efficient operations continue to happen and they won't do so without sort of constant nurturing and development. Things like continuous improvement fit into that category. So again, seeking common goals, when we think about things from a supply chain perspective and what we call a classic commercialization pipeline, from research and discovery all the way through to final sales and marketing, what we've got to do is understand that we need feedback all the way through, but also we've got to be on top, up above at a systems level that enables us to see common goals that are going to work in everyone's favour. When we talk about leveraging the ecosystem, we talk about 3 different levels. We talk about interpersonal level collaboration. So a good intrapreneur is very good at interpersonal relationships to help them understand where they're working at. They're really good at inter-team level collaboration and relationships as well. And finally, very savvy at collaboration between organisation and the customer or the operating environment of the organisation itself. Which brings us to a couple of more of the 10 tools. This idea of the common mistake that if we hold things too tight, and too tightly control the means, often what we find is we constrain the achievement of the outcomes. So having to understand what we hold tight and centralize versus what we allow to decentralize is a critical notion in ensuring that organizations are innovative and staff are allowed to be creative. So that's a really important notion, this operational flexibility tool with strategic consistency, but also allowing operational flexibility. The next tool is the notion of forgetting about our stakeholders, understanding that reaching out to stakeholders, getting feedback early enables us to avoid unintended consequences. And that notion of the spider web and the web of interrelationships is something that entrepreneurs have a very strong instinct for. Talking about customers and being very customer-centric, there's this idea of the iceberg. And the iceberg metaphor in systems thinking is about understanding that when we're looking at an iceberg, we're only ever looking at the top 13% of the iceberg. The rest of it's always under the water, the unseen. And when we're talking to customers about what their needs, wants, and desires are, what we really need to do is not stop at the surface of the iceberg, but actually look deep below the surface to come up with stuff that people would not have otherwise created. And one of the really strong system thinking metaphors that I often use is systems currently are perfectly designed to get the results that they currently get. So if you need the results to change, you've got to get below that surface. So understanding the internal, external environment, including processes, structures, relationships, interactions below that surface, that's 87% of the iceberg that we can't see, is really crucial to getting delivery of outcomes that the customer desires. And remembering too, structures influence behavior. So the way delivery structures and channels are designed for customer to minimize the customer cost of transacting with you is also a core systems thinking and entrepreneurial skill. Customer empathy is found below the surface of the iceberg. This is just a diagram just to illustrate to you our ABC model, the systems thinking approach design thinking, and you'll see that we've color-coded this cyclical model to fit the Stanford model colors, as you can see in the bottom left corner. And the core first thing you have to do is establish empathy with the customer. That's your primary purpose when you're system thinking and design thinking. A really excellent tool to do that with customers is what we call the value proposition map, which is obviously a central component of the business model canvas. But remembering the first two things you need to do is get to your customers, expose what your minimum viable product may be, and then establish what the pain and gain points are for your customers. Exposing your mental models to customers early is a crucial entrepreneurial systems thinking tool. This is a nice little summary of what we see entrepreneurs are very capable of. Success doesn't come from breaking up the information that you receive from customers into pieces, but being able to connect the various fragmented, disparate pieces of information across the whole supply chain into what we call meaningful wholes, and to detect the new patterns that are evolving. Airbnb is a wonderful example of what the founders have said, the stupidest idea that ever worked. But they were able to connect the dots and create those meaningful wholes. Another bonus book that I've read just recently over the summer break is a thing called Simple Rules, which leverages this notion that business models, successful business models, can all be distilled down to three simple principles or three simple rules. In our context, we've got a little triangle there, and there are three simple questions that we always ask entrepreneurs is, who do you serve? What needs do they have that we fulfill? And what do you produce to meet those needs? And then beyond that is, what is our point of difference relating to that? So the final two tools that I'll just talk through with you briefly, of course, are the root causes. And this is something that is a really strong systems thinking principle, but so often really overlooked by many people. And that what it really comes down to is the ultimate effect of an event in a market may not be felt for some time, at some time period or some time gap, and the impact may be completely dislocated from that particular event as well. And so understanding the connection or the root causes of what you're seeing is a really strong entrepreneurial skill. And finally, keeping things simple. And coming back to that book that I mentioned earlier, Three Simple Rules is a really important capacity of entrepreneurs. I just wanted to finish with a case study that I love and I use in other workshops as well. It's the SEABIN story. So if you think about the SEABIN story, it's a couple of Western Australian entrepreneurs who grew up together in Perth's beaches surfing their life away, and they developed this essentially a pool filter cleaner, like the one that sits in most pools around Australia, with this drain that sits behind the flap on the side of the pool. They've actually created one for marinas, so it sits just slightly submerged below the surface, like a big basketball hoops sucking in plastics and other rubbish on the surface of marinas. And why is that such a really clever systems thinking principle? Because that's their invention. That's what they've launched. They've gone global with it. They've gone to the largest marina manufacturer in the world, just happens to be in Mallorca in Spain, but they've couched it in terms of what they call the SEABIN project. Their mission is to clean up the seas of the world, because their mantra is, unless we do something for the amount of plastic going into the seas around the world, by 2050, the tonnage of plastic sitting in our oceans will be more than the fish in the ocean. So that's really powerful systems thinking. As they've worked on their journey from 2004 to 2016, they've always considered the partnerships and the relationships they've created on that entrepreneurial journey within the whole context of saving our oceans. So this last section I'm just going to clip through really quickly. It's the questions that sit behind the 10 tools that I've just shown you and gone through quickly for you, so you can go back over those at your leisure. And I just wanted to finish off on a couple of last slides. And this is something that we really emphasize when we're talking to entrepreneurs and other people who are trying to change the systems within which they're operating. What you think, or what you know, or what you believe is in the end of very little consequence. The only consequence is what we do. And so we encourage people to act. Small deeds done are better than great deeds planned. So moving to action is a really important systems thinking concept. We do some mentoring and coaching. Remember those 3 levels that we were talking about earlier, 3A, 4A and 5A. And there's some nice tools available. You think about being more effectively as an entrepreneur or intrapreneur at those different system levels. And of course, this is the method that we use when we're working with those sort of people. We get them up in the balcony. We talk about what they're seeing and the system that that they're working within. The dance floor is the metaphor you're looking at from the balcony, and then coming up with actions and next steps to adjust and cycle through the loop to become more effective on that dance floor when they're trying to work in and change the systems that they're trying to work with. And so now we'll just stop for questions, Leanne.
Thank you very much, Louis. Look, that's wow. I feel like I've been on a flying carpet ride through the systems thinking, and having done some workshops with you before, I've been able to place those concepts as you've raised them. We do have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to undock the panel here so I can start looking at that. Okay, so Steve is asking, what is the systems thinking view on flat organisations versus hierarchical organisations? Where's the sweet spot on how flat or how layered an organisation should be? So maybe you're up with that?
Yep, good question. And that relates to, I think it was tool number 7, when we talked about strategic consistency, but operational flexibility. And in its purest form, when we're thinking about system layers within an organization, obviously you've got the organization, how it interfaces with the economy, the customers. Inside that you have departments or teams, and inside that you've got individuals who work within those departments and teams. And our philosophy is, the systems thinking philosophy is, you devolve or delegate decision making around resources to the lowest possible level within any organization, such that the feedback on the success or otherwise of that invested resource or allocated resource is as immediate as possible. The longer the loop is, for feedback, a la if it goes back up to the executive rather than down to people at the coalface, the less responsive the organisation will be in terms of its success with customers or whatever other service delivery that they provide. So just to reflect, strategic consistency, operational flexibility gives people at the coalface freedom over the resources to make the best decisions that they can at the time. Now, I just wanted to do a quick ad for a concept called holacracy, HOLACRCY, holacracy. Just Google that, and we're working with those people to consider as flat an organisation as possible to achieve those outcomes that I've just described earlier. But what's required is quite a nimble and agile. That word agile is obviously a very popular word nowadays, but having small teams with decision-making power over resources enables them to be more agile. So holacracy, Google holacracy. Thanks, Leanne.
That's great. Thank you very much, Louis. Question here from Michelle. Can you be systematic and still be a lateral thinker if you're jumping across patterns?
Okay, so systematic, I assume, is meant to be sort of rigorous and well structured in your activities and execution of a plan. And my short answer to the question is yes, you can be. But when we're talking about jumping across patterns, if you remember when I showed you the effectuation style of thinking, that effectuation style of thinking implies that you invest a relatively small amount of time, effort, and energy to prove your next hypothesis, moving you towards the outcome you're trying to achieve. And depending on the results of that effort, you may choose to pivot slightly in a different direction to then continue to head in the direction you want to go. So coming back to reflecting on what you asked in the second part of the question, can you still be both by jumping patterns? Yes, provided you manage the amount of effort you put into every step. You know, don't overcommit yourself to a particular outcome before you've proved. Best off breaking it into smaller steps in a systematic way. Leanne?
Yeah, and I think that heralds back to what you were saying about the need to be flexible as well. Yeah, a question
Seeking
here from
feedback early. Early feedback's best. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Okay, and a question here from John. What happens when a system fails in this context?
Depending on where you are in the system, remembering that they're nested systems. So from the individual to the team to the organisation to the environment within which your organisation works, understanding that is really crucial. Then also understanding that if you are a closed system, like you're not taking any feedback or you're not scanning the environment within which you're the nested inside, then you won't know until it's too late that the system above you has failed, because you're not preparing yourself for that feedback to tell you that things are changing. That means I need to change to ensure that my survival is possible in this new environment. So an example I think about in terms of illustrating that is obviously the global financial crisis was a shock across all systems, and pretty much everyone everywhere was impacted by it. Some were able to respond more rapidly than others because they are more permeable to those signals that may have been sent to enable you to respond before anyone else did. So coming back to system failure, what you need to be aware of is that it could happen at any time, and the way to manage that is to constantly be scanning your external environment, whether you're an individual inside a team, whether you're a team inside an organization, or whether you're an organization that makes up an industry. Continuously scanning is the way to stay ahead of systems failure.
Okay, thank you, Lewe. And a question from Simon. I get it. Do you have any tips for helping me get my team to get it and to think like a system?
Thanks, Simon. That makes a few of us, Simon. I know there's a frustration amongst systems thinkers about, geez, how do we get this really useful set of tools and insights mainstream? And the way we think it's possible is to chunk it up into small tools like the 10 I showed you. We're constantly evolving these tools and keeping them up to date. But chunking up into small tools allow people to get success from just application of one or two of the tools, and then more and more confidence to reinforce the good decision-making practices that associate with that. And then over time, you generally reveal to them and your systems thinking. And sort of once they've got those early, low-hanging fruit, early wins under their belt, they're more confident to make the jump to, more sophisticated levels of systems thinking. The other thing that's really encouraging, Simon, is the Waters Foundation, WATERS, Waters Foundation in the USA, a philanthropic organisation who are specialising in teaching children to be systems thinkers, and they have a 12-tool app which I can recommend highly. You just go onto the Waters Foundation, onto the iStore, Habits of a Systems Thinker. I've got the phone open right in front of me now, and wonderful tool, really simple tool, easy to sort of, have team meetings around tools like the ones we've been talking about today. Small incremental steps towards, mainstream realization of the power of it. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you, Lewe. Look, we're just on time at the moment. I'll just do a last call for any final questions coming through. If there's anything that's that you've thought of while the other questions have been answered. I'll just check, see if there's any more questions coming through. No, that looks like it. I'd like to thank you again, Lewe, for coming on board with us today and sharing your insights, and especially the very clear use of the tools that will help everybody with their not only with their own systems thinking, but with helping others to appreciate the value of this approach. And I know that there's some more, a lot of information is in the handout. So for those of you still on the line, and there's quite a few, please download the handouts before you go to make sure that you can make use of those and reflect on the webinar, reading against those handouts. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make that available to everybody who's tuned in. So don't worry if you felt that you missed out at some point, because you will be able to tune in at a later date. Any last words, Lewe?
If there's anyone out there who wants to work with me to take systems thinking mainstream, please contact me, because we'll do whatever it takes, because we know it's such a valuable approach.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you, Louis. Well, everyone, I hope the rest of your evening is a pleasant one, and that you'll be starting to think like a system and acting like an entrepreneur straight away. We do have some other webinars coming up. We've got one on innovative HR strategies. We've got one on sports tech, another one on making the most out of Myriad, and one on virtual reality and augmented reality. So make sure that you stay in touch with the Innovate Queensland program to get the information to register for those events as they come up. And perhaps we'll see some of you at our Making Innovation Herstory event next week with the to coincide with International Women's Day. So that wraps it up from Innovate Queensland and the Grid program for now, and we look forward to enjoying your company and questions next time. Thanks very much, everyone.